Hey folks, welcome back. Hope you're doing well out there. So today's Bicycle Day, and Bicycle Day, for anyone who's not familiar, is a kind of international holiday of the anniversary of the discovery of LSD way back in the day by Albert Hoffman. So in this video, I'm going to be discussing all things LSD. So if you're interested in LSD as a topic, if you're interested in my take about it, my thoughts about the current kind of cutting edge of LSD therapy, research, my own personal experience, I'm going to be going over all that in this video. So if you'd like to join me for perhaps a more casual, recreational conversation about LSD on Bicycle Day, join me. Okay, so the point of this video isn't really to retell the story of Bicycle Day. I feel like that's been done better elsewhere, and there's plenty of that content already online. So I'm just going to give a real quick kind of recap. And if you want a more in-depth summary of what happened, I'll leave a link to a video down below that you can check out if you're not familiar with Bicycle Day and you're like, oh, sounds interesting. It's quite a story, honestly, and worth learning about just as kind of a historical anecdote that I think is unusual and fascinating. So the long and the short of it is that Bicycle Day is the anniversary of the day that Albert Hoffman, who's a Swiss scientist and he was working in a lab in the early 40s, accidentally spilled LSD on his hand, I believe, for what is the first time in history probably a human dosing of LSD that we know about for sure, right? And then obviously went and had the first known acid trip, right? And it was so alarming and weird as the effects kicked in that essentially he, had to go home and go chill out because he was unable to work high on a solid dose of LSD. And so he hopped on his bike, which was his mode of transportation, and rode home and notoriously had what was described as a very strange, very trippy bike ride home. Imagine having no context for psychedelic experiences, not knowing that was a thing really or that really existed, suddenly being very dosed on LSD, trying to ride your bike home. It would be alarming and bizarre and strange at a minimum. So historically, that's what Bicycle Day means. That's what it represents. In the more modern context, it's come to mean kind of an international celebration of psychedelics. It's kind of a day where all over the world, the psychedelic community will celebrate altered states of consciousness and the power of psychedelics and the way they've transformed, our societies around the world and different aspects of society around the world. In particular, it's a day to really reflect on LSD and its role in the counterculture movement and blah, 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 blah. So it's a day to kind of celebrate psychedelics and the gifts they bring and the power they have and the beauty of them, right? So that's what Bicycle Day is in a nutshell. Again, if you want to learn more, link down below. You can check out another video. It's not, it's good enough. It's not my favorite video ever. I'm sure there may be a better one. So if you know of a better one, feel free to link it in the comments below also. But it's a good primer for anyone who's not at all familiar with the story. So with that being said, I want to pivot. I want to talk a little bit about kind of my observations, my thoughts about the current state of LSD in the kind of psychedelic therapy landscape, as far as I understand what I've been hearing in the underground, what I'm hearing from other psychedelic therapists, where I think it's useful, all that kind of stuff. And then I want to talk a little bit about my own personal history with LSD because it's a pivotal experience in medicine in my own history, my own life. And I'd love to just share some of my thoughts about that with you guys. So we'll do that, then we'll wrap the video and we'll just kind of keep this more of a light discussion, kind of just celebrating LSD and its role in consciousness. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the cutting edge and where it's at right now. So as you might imagine, I have quite a few thoughts about the current state of LSD. So on this channel, I've already done one video about my thoughts on, legalizing organic plant medicines, or decriminalizing, not legalizing, like they're doing in places like Oakland or here in Colorado or, other parts of the country. There's starting to be a decrim movement, but it's all centered around organic plant medicines and it explicitly excludes LSD or 2CB or other synthetic psychedelics, right? So I made a video about that and how I thought that was kind of whack, kind of crazy. So you can go back and watch that if you want my thoughts on that particular angle on things. But I wanted to just kind of give you a bit of my different insights and perspective on the current where we're at with LSD, right? The first thing that kind of comes to mind is being really obvious is that LSD is very much the unsung underdog of the psychedelic therapy landscape as it exists right now in 2024, right? So to me, that is bizarre. um, I have a huge amount of love and respect for LSD as a tool, as a medicine, as a therapy tool, as a personal growth tool, as a spiritual tool. I think it's profoundly powerful, obviously, and profoundly useful. It's really a very flexible, very useful tool once you get used to it. I mean, it has its own learning curve, like any psychedelic does, but once you get in your groove with it, it's very useful for a wide variety of applications. And this you know, kind of gets me to like some of the points here. So I'm just looking at my notes here to kind of pick apart what I want to talk about here. So the first thing I want to say is really, I think it's bizarre the way that LSD is so unsung. And I want to just kind of name this and call this out because it's it's really like there's no good reason for it from my point of view. So from my point of view, in terms of whether you're using it personally for healing purposes or for like a spiritual purpose, or recreational purpose, I mean, that's valid too, right? Or whether we're even talking using it in the context of psychedelic therapy, in the context of a guided session or a healing session, I think in a lot of ways, LSD is easier to work with. I think it's, often a better tool for depression because it tends to be a little more dopaminergic and therefore a bit more exciting and uplifting and energizing. Um, it has the same serotonergic impact and effects more or less as psilocybin. So you're going to get all the same antidepressant effects that you would from psilocybin. Offers the same potential for like a mystical experience, non-dual ego death experiences. Offers the same, potential for sense of, recalling memories, unpacking old traumas, processing things, mindfulness, developing metacognition. That's all there with LSD, just like it is with psilocybin. But you have less body load if you're taking clean LSD. Generally, no nausea. There are exceptions sometimes, but it's pretty rare. It lasts longer, which might sound horrible at first glance, but I often hear from people who are just getting familiar with psychedelics. They prefer the length of LSD because it actually gives you more time in that space to really do the work and unpack things. Psilocybin can be kind of like short, and your window of opportunity to really make some changes and do some deep work or to let go and have a full transcendence, it's a smaller window, right? So LSD is overall, from my point of view, and this is just one person's opinion, and grain of salt, I would say for therapeutic purposes, I would say it's the better tool. There's less like body load getting in the way, less tendency to kind of make you really like have a negative, intensely emotional, overwhelming experience, which I suspect is kind of largely tied to the body load part of psilocybin. It's smoother, it's often cleaner, it's more alert and awake feeling, and it can deliver all the same benefits, right? So I think in a lot of ways LSD is a really good tool, but yet it's really, at least here in the US, I know in Europe it's a little bit of a different story. It's really undersung as a tool. It's really been put on the back burner, and it's interesting to me how and why that is. So I want to kind of name this a little bit too. So from my point of view and from what I understand, having discussions, a big part of the reason LSD is not the poster child for psychedelic therapy the way psilocybin is, there's kind of a couple of reasons for this. A major one is that, clinicians actually shape a lot of the perception that ends up going into marketing in terms of like maps and, psychedelic, therapy being kind of a marketed concept out there in the psychedelic therapy space. And clinicians also shape how the law perceives these things too, right? And clinicians largely chose psilocybin to study as a psychedelic because it's shorter duration, right? So one of the major reasons they chose psilocybin over LSD, is because it lasts a shorter amount of time, and therefore it requires less of the clinicians or the psychologists sitting with people doing the work with people, it's less hours that you have to spend in a study, right? Psilocybin's like a 6 hour, 4 to 6 hour experience. LSD is more like an 8 to 12, right? And so it's quite a big difference in terms of duration. If you're running studies and you've got to do a bunch of these, having a 6 hour a day sounds so much more reasonable than a 12-hour day, right? And so this is part of why psilocybin was chosen and studied. It's not necessarily that it's a better tool necessarily, right? It's not that it's optimal for this work. It was just, easier to do. The other thing here is that, psilocybin was, doesn't have the same cultural baggage. I do think, and this blows my mind, it's really like an appeal to nature kind of fallacy that, our governmental agencies and the marketing around this feels like psilocybin is, better or safer because it's natural, right? So there's another piece here, which is that LSD has cultural baggage around it that psilocybin doesn't quite have, which is really striking, right? So obviously a lot of the cultural baggage around LSD, at least here in the US, and it's interesting to note how that's impacted policy in other countries, because why should it, right? But it's interesting how, a lot of the cultural baggage here was from the counterculture in the 60s and Timothy Leary encouraging, young baby boomers to tune in, turn on, drop out. And that was so horrific and extreme for the era. And he did a lot of damage to the credibility of, very real studies being done, in terms of psychedelic therapy, that they just shut the whole thing down. And apparently, I wasn't alive in the 60s, right? So apparently, it created such a strong cultural imprint that really lasted for a long time. The counterculture obviously is a mixed blessing, at least here in the States. Around the world, we could talk about it from different angles, but I think it's parallel in a lot of Western countries. In the States, it was clearly a mixed blessing of creating cultural revolution or being a part of cultural revolution, but also having a lot of shadow aspects, a lot of drawbacks, a lot of failures with it. It wasn't all that it kind of was marketed and purported to be. What's funny to me about that is surely psilocybin mushrooms were part of the counterculture all along the way as well, right? I mean, we know that for fact, right? Hippies were not just taking LSD, they were also taking psilocybin all through the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and blah, 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 right? So that's very just as much to do with the adverse effects that we've seen from psychedelics over the decades as LSD. But somehow it never got that same level of baggage that LSD did. And I think that has a lot to do maybe with Leary, which I hate to say because there's a lot about Leary's work that has really transformed my life and really been something I admire. But, the negative cultural impact is a very real thing. Other things I want to say about LSD and the cutting edge here. So just to summarize my rambling here, there's no good reason why we're not using it as a psychedelic therapy tool or why it's not being talked about more, right? There's no good reason, from my point of view, why favor mushrooms unless you want a shorter journey. But even then, I would probably, go with synthetic psilocybin over, mushrooms because there's less body load, right? So I respect mushrooms. They've been powerful teachers in my own life. I have a lot of love for mushrooms, but they're tough. It's a hard experience. I was talking with a psychedelic therapist recently who's above ground, and he was saying, it's weird that this is the medicine they're pushing because it's one of the hardest to work with, from a medicine, psychedelic medicine point of view, and from like learning all the different plant medicines. Mushrooms are like a master medicine. They are a difficult tool to really get good with. And yet this is the one that's popularized and everyone's just, you look online, you'll see plenty of examples of people just eating 7-10 grams of mushrooms with no experience and expecting it to go well. It's just, it's from an experienced person's point of view, it's a little kooky, right? But yeah, to summarize, LSD is often a better tool. It really can be such a wonderful, effective ally for addressing depression in particular, maybe anxiety at the right dose, used in the right way, depending on the person. Definitely for spiritual growth purposes, for like transcendence and ego death, that kind of a thing. It's just a great tool. Debatably, in my opinion, the better tool between that and psilocybin. And I would recommend it for most people. And that sounds crazy if your conception around LSD is that it's this wild, crazy, intense thing. But I would argue that's no wilder or crazier than psilocybin. So if you're going to be doing psilocybin, I think LSD is equally valid, or if perhaps not more easy to use. On that note, what we see a lot right now in the LSD landscape and the research landscape is a lot of uh, LSD kind of derivatives, not just analogs. Like there's definitely in the underground, in the black market, and I'm not going to tell you where to find this stuff. There, and even in the ClearNet in other countries, there's popularity of LSD analogs, right? So these are not strictly the LSD molecule. They're minor tweaks that essentially convert to LSD in your body, and the experience is close, if not identical, but strictly speaking, not LSD 25. But what we're seeing now is a lot of pharma companies, both private pharma companies and big pharma companies, experimenting with abstractions of LSD for therapeutic purposes. And I think this is an interesting space. I'm open-minded about it. I don't have a strong opinion about it either way at this point. But they're trying to do things like a non-trip LSD to be used as a depression medication, or I believe perhaps as an anxiety medication. They've done studies now with abstractions of LSD, finding that it can be highly effective for anxiety. I'd be curious about what the effects of this altered type of LSD is, because generally LSD can kind of exaggerate a person's anxiety and amplify it. So it's got to be working in some different fashion from classic LSD 25. And there's just a bunch of these, right? There are a bunch of these kind of things in the works behind the scenes that we're hearing buzz about, but we don't entirely know about yet. So it will be interesting to see how these kind of LSD derivatives and alterations come to market as kind of newly branded pharmaceuticals, what their applications are. I'm super curious. Yeah, it should be very interesting. Of mixed mind, I'm sure there are a lot of you out there who might be kind of closed-minded to that, especially if you're kind of like a purist, like, you've done a lot of LSD in your life, you come from a tradition, whether it's the Grateful Dead community or, the kind of rainbow community or the psytrance community, or even one of these like heavily psychedelic communities. you know, you may be opposed, right, to these kind of pharma introductions of these weird alterations of it. But I think it's an interesting space. I think we should remain curious and see where it goes. Could be really good. And maybe if they make a short acting 3-hour LSD, that could be really popular. Or if they make an LSD that doesn't cause you to hallucinate, but you could take as a mood booster and get that kind of euphoria and that kind of up positive feeling, that might be really useful. So we'll see how this all goes. That's about all I have to say about LSD. There are definitely new studies coming out. There's one about an altered LSD that I just mentioned that reduces anxiety, etc. Right? So there's a bunch of stuff going on in this space, and I think it'll be really fun to watch. I want to pivot though, and I want to share a little bit about my own personal experience with it, just in case you're curious. If you're not curious, feel free to switch off the video, but I thought I'd share a bit of a personal share of how LSD's impacted my life, just in case you want to know. So let's talk about it. Okay, so on to my own experience here. I will be transparent with you. LSD has been a major part of my life. It has been massively transformative. And the TLDR here is I could wax poetic for a long time about it, and I have a lot of love for it, right? So if that's all you want to know about my relationship to LSD, feel free to switch off the video. That's really it. To be a little more specific, it's the medicine that I have the most experience with. I have logged countless hours, with LSD. And that is both in a recreational context, kind of a private personal use context of, say, meditating at home, doing yoga on LSD, playing guitar on LSD, sitting and reflecting about my life, these kinds of things. Or whether this is in a more therapeutic context of working on myself or having someone work with me or being sat or these kinds of things. LSD, when it came into my life, I had a drive and a curiosity about it at a very young age. Actually, I was kind of fascinated just that it was a thing and that it existed. way back when I was young. I was probably like 12, 13, and I was already fascinated with it. Learned as much as I could about it back then. We're talking at, for my age, late 80s, early 90s. This was a very different time in terms of accessing information about LSD, but I was riveted and fascinated and scared, and really had like a kind of a cautious, like a healthy caution around it. Of course, it didn't help that that was the era of like dare and you'll fry your brain and all kinds of fear propaganda around it. And of course, my parents, as I'm growing up, entering into high school, being like, please don't do these drugs and they're bad for you, and all generally, good messages, right? But nonetheless, I was fascinated. I was just absolutely riveted. And probably in hindsight, debatably, I mean, we could look at this from different angles. Perhaps I intuited that there was purpose there for me or something important there for me. Perhaps also in hindsight, I intuited that this would be an important tool for my own personal healing or personal growth and deconditioning some of the traumatic events and experiences I went through as a kid. So I don't know that to be a fact. There's no way I could know if that's really what my unconscious was thinking at that age. I just knew it was interesting, right? And kind of the intersection of Woodstock and hippies and rock and roll and psychedelics and not really Grateful Dead yet. That took a while to grow on me, but yeah. Long story short, I eventually took LSD for the first time somewhere in high school, probably sophomore year or something like that, probably like 1992, something like that. It was very good, very high quality LSD. It was pure liquid, probably from what's his name, the grain silo. I'm forgetting his name right now. Sorry if you're watching. But the guy who made all the LSD in the 90s, there was an abundance of liquid around at the time. It was probably his stuff. Took it, had an absolutely fantastic, transformative, fun experience with some dear friends of mine. And that really began my journey of exploring LSD. It started very recreational for me. It started very much about play and music and, weird, funny adventures around town and, tripping balls at my friend's house, that kind of thing. But pivoted and progressed pretty quickly because as we're taking it, we're of course getting into your Alan Watts, your Ram Dass's, your Timothy Leary's, and that kind of points you back towards some spiritual frameworks of understanding around LSD, which I started to read and take in and were incredibly valuable and useful in being able to work with LSD well. So one of the things I'll say, reflecting on my own history here is I think it's really, really valuable, even if you don't consider yourself a spiritual person, you're a bit of an atheist or an agnostic, and you don't like the kind of religious overtones of spiritual information. I think having those kinds of frameworks as narratives to understand some of these experiences is better to have than to not have. Let's put it that way. Like, I think if you don't have these frameworks and these narratives in place, the experience can be so alarming and disjointing and scrambling for your ego that I think it's a lot harder, and when I've compared and contrasted myself or friends like me who came from like a more spiritual framework into psychedelics versus friends of mine that I adore who are also serious psychonauts but really are kind of anti-spiritual, and I see the quality of types of experiences that people have and how well that goes down. I think in general, people with a spiritual framework tend to tolerate psychedelic experiences better and have something constructive or positive or life affirming come out of that. So I'm not saying it's a must, but I'm saying it appeared in my life at that time and it was incredibly useful. LSD taught me a lot about mindfulness, right? So around that time, I also not only got into LSD and Timothy Leary and Ram Dass and that whole bubble, that kind of pointed me back, of course, towards like Be Here Now and Hinduism and meditation, right? And so I started to take up a meditation practice and having these moments of just like wide open kind of consciousness with no thinking and just kind of full presence and full being really gave me a really clear kind of North Star of what to work towards in terms of meditative states. So in that sense, it was incredibly valuable and useful. And in hindsight, I could also say that those early experiences of LSD for me also provided a lot of the development of metacognition this capacity for mindfulness, for observing my own thoughts or observing my own inner experience, my own emotions, and witnessing them and kind of being present with them. If you've watched any of my other videos, you'll know when I was around 17, so this is around that time, I had my first ego death experience through a book that was read to me called The Psychedelic Experience, which is what I used to create the guided mystical experience, which is down below if you want to take that course and you want to have it read to you and you wanted a guided experience. It's all pre-made for you. It's all ready to go. So that was all based on an experience I had at 17, where my friend found this book and he, read this book to me and his girlfriend at the time. And we had full ego dissolution, non-dual oneness experiences. And, quite frankly, as a 17-year-old in the early 90s, I didn't even have like a conceptual framework for that. I was new to Buddhism and Hinduism and knew some of the concepts there, but I didn't really have this like real clear understanding that there is a type of experience that is beyond thinking and beyond emotion and beyond identity, that is super deep and profoundly spiritual. I didn't even know that existed. And yet, I ended up having this kind of experience, as did his partner. And it was incredible. It was life-changing. It was absolutely transformative and really cemented a very clear understanding in me of spirituality, spiritual path, and what I'm working towards in a spiritual path. And that really kind of motivated me to start to take up, a more serious spiritual practice. So that kind of happened 17 and then in 18 and onward. I continued on with LSD, just to give you not give you my whole history with it because it's 30 years, but I continued on through my college, years, as you might imagine. There's a lot of, Grateful Dead shows and Fish shows and acid and, hanging out with friends. And it was, for me at that point, a mix of recreational and spiritual, and it was lovely and it was fun and life affirming. That kind of ended up, and this is a conversation perhaps for another time, so let me know if you're even watching this and you resonate with this. Let me comment down below. It kind of ended up deconditioning me so much that I lost, my drive to be on track to graduate college and be on the straight and narrow in terms of getting into the workforce. And I kind of became one of these people who was a bit of a burnout, dropout, didn't want to participate in standard default society, much to my parents' chagrin, of course, and kind of just pursued following my bliss and, leaning into this kind of hippie, new age community that I discovered, and music and yada, yada, blah, blah, blah. That kind of led me finding the rave community, and that's kind of a whole other huge chapter of my life that led me to the festival community and all that. Talk about that another time if you guys want to know. All of that to say, I went through a long period of being untethered from the track I was on, maybe in high school, which wasn't a real solid track, if I'm going to be frank. My parents tried to push me into, a career path and a college degree and a paying job, even though I wasn't really clear what I wanted, who I was, what I needed, that this was right for me, right? So there's a lot of, it's classic, like boomer parenting in the 90s, right? Go to college, get a degree, get a job, And so all of that felt deeply wrong to me. I kind of rebelled against it rather on a really deep level. Ended up, in this whole community, kind of not really knowing, what was next for me. And I do see a lot of young people ending up in this kind of place, and especially when psychedelics are involved, it's very easy to end up kind of rebelling against the status quo. And then you're kind of just free and loose and weird, and you have no idea, what you're really going to do. And then there's the giant question of figuring all that out. All of that eventually led to me, of course, realizing I had issues that I had to sort out for myself. I had blocks in the way to my success. And that kind of led me into pursuing personal development. That led me into pursuing, NLP and hypnosis and learning how to coach, and kind of here we are, basically. So that's kind of my personal history with LSD. It has been a real key not only for deconditioning myself from the kind of early societal conditioning, um, not only for helping me develop myself spiritually, um, and I would say cognitively. I would say LSD taught me a lot about how to think better, right? About how to think. Um, it was also a major key for me to uh, get imprinted by healthier people around me in community. So a lot of, while I was kind of in this hippie phase, there's a lot of exploring festivals and communities and events and, raves out in the woods and this kind of thing. And there were a lot of psychedelics involved. And there's a lot of like people working through their similar stuff, their upbringing, and coming together to really co-heal and bringing a lot of positive energy together, and had a lot of really beautiful social experiences and personal reference experiences. Even little things like learning how to receive a massage. Like LSD taught me about that, because a friend would just start rubbing on me and working on me. I'd be like, oh, that's amazing. I just kind of breathe into it and relax. And that translated into a comfort with body work that some people just don't have. There's a lot of things like that, or just being able to be eye to eye with someone and eye gaze and be connected and present and have a heart to heart human conversation. That kind of thing outside of a festival space is freakishly rare, and sadly, like not a feature in most of our societies. And so sometimes you go into these festival spaces and they're kind of autonomous zones where the standard rules of society don't apply as much. And in that, assuming you're around good people and in a good situation, there can be some real opportunities for deep learning of other ways of living and being and seeing and understanding. And, LSD was a real key part of that for me. So I want to be honest about that with you. Let me see what else. LSD taught me an absolute an absolute ton about music, about being creative, about listening, about attentiveness and presence to the moment, about loosening up and being playful, about being accepting of weirdness and silliness, because of course, if you're hanging out with people on LSD, weirdness and silliness is going to be part of the package. LSD, of course, taught me a lot about, the more cosmic layer of life, and that there is a cosmic layer to life, and there's a whole other thing going on here. And LSD taught me a lot about opening my heart and feeling connected and loving. It taught me a lot about compassion, honestly, like as much as MDMA, if not more. And that coupled with like spiritual practices for, like a meditation or something like that to open the heart, it's been an absolute gift of a tool. And, in hindsight, I would probably say now, well, I am saying now, that it was a major key thing to help me start to undo probably what was complex trauma for me. It didn't do all the work by itself. Like I've been pretty clear on this channel that LSD in and of itself does not fix complex PTSD trauma, nor does psilocybin or MDMA or any of the psychedelics, because there's a certain amount of know-how of how to connect the dots, right? There's a way to do this that really makes all the difference. But it really started to help me realize that a lot of the feelings I was having, the needs I was having, the urges I was having, the orientation towards the world I had was valid, was real. There were real things that were off in my upbringing and that needed tending to. And there was something here for me to heal, right? And I don't know if I would have arrived at that so easily at such a young age, meaning late 20s in my case, had I not like gone through the psychedelic portal for so long and encountered so many other amazing people and healers and teachers along the way as part of that. So yeah, I would also say that, just broad strokes, and I'm talking about myself here, but on a macro level, I would say, it's an interesting question about whether or not LSD is a net good or net negative for society. I could definitely see more conservative arguments where in a lot of ways, because LSD deconditions people from societal conditioning, It might be a negative thing. It could be destructive. Obviously, a lot of people have been harmed in terms of, having permanent changes happen, triggering latent schizophrenia, that kind of thing. Um, and that's all. I think those damages are very real and all very worth acknowledging as perhaps a bit tragic. Um, and and I can see the argument, and I think it's valid to a certain degree, that LSD has done a lot of damage to the social fabric in terms of setting people loose, but then people not really like refining their freedom into um, a more well honed, more cohesive society. I think we're still seeing these ripples of kind of the just straight up like set it all free kind of vibe of the 60s rippling through society today. And I think when I encountered LSD in the 90s, that was true then, right? There was definitely an echo in the 90s of the 60s. And I kind of rode that wave myself. I think it's very easy for LSD or any psychedelic to put people in kind of a weird place that's really disjointed or really disconnected or more scrambled essentially and less organized. And I think it takes a certain kind of person to have the will to organize yourself from that kind of openness, right? You have to like really self-trust. You have to really have an intention towards organizing yourself and not just letting these things just smear you around because they can, right? So I could see where that is perhaps one of the net negatives over time here. But I think there are a lot of net positives too. I don't know if we would have a lot of the positive social movements that we've had since the 60s grow and take root and expand without the presence of psychedelics. I don't think modern music would nearly be what it is or nearly be the same, if we hadn't had, the rock movement in the 60s and the 70s and, the rave movement of the 90s onward. I think psychedelics and LSD in particular dramatically impacted the creative community. I think it dramatically impacted the therapy community, whether or not, all therapists would agree with that statement, or even obviously a lot of therapists didn't take psychedelics and, that really wasn't their background, but it shaped a lot of the thinking in, the therapy community and also the personal development community, the whole human potential movement and Esalen and all of that, right? That was largely fueled by psychedelics. Not completely. It was kind of the intersection of brilliant minds exploring interesting topics and big questions, and psychedelics were part of that, but they definitely were, and so I don't know if we'd have a lot of the kind of cutting edge ideas, same with big tech. I don't know if we would have big tech in its current iteration and the internet in its current iteration, for better or worse, and that is a huge debate, without LSD being in the culture, right? So I guess just to close this video, because I'm kind of riffing here, I'm not really, again, this is more of a casual conversation. To close this video, what I would say is I'm personally deeply grateful for LSD. It holds a very sacred place in my life, as you might imagine. It's been a wonderful teacher. It's been a wonderful tool for growth. Sure, there's been some weird moments and some scary moments and a lot of uncomfortable moments. And I'm grateful that I've gotten through it safely and gracefully, to be honest. But I think it's an amazing tool, and I'm glad it exists in the world. And sometimes I think about in Be Here Now. If any of you read Be Here Now, his teacher Maharaji says at one point, I think whether this is literally true or metaphorically true, I think it resonates for me, which is the West is a materialistic place, and so God had to come to the West in a materialistic form, right? And so, just as an idea, I think that's a compelling way to think about LSD. That it is this awakening tool, this disruptor, this shake it up thing that, if properly used, can be super, super valuable. And I'm happy it exists. I'm happy we know it's safe, generally speaking. Probably not a massive negative impact to people's health, generally speaking. And I'm just super grateful for its impact in my own life. And so I think I'm going to wrap it there. And I would love to know if you've watched this whole video and you've listened to me kind of waffle on about this. What are your experiences with LSD, right? How has it impacted your life? Have you taken it yet? Do you have an interest in taking it? Are you scared of it? What are your thoughts about the way it's impacted society? What are your thoughts about the future of LSD? I'd be curious to know any of that. So, without further ado, let's wrap for now. I'm done talking. Thank you for listening if you made it through the whole video. Much love to you all. If you're going to go out tonight on Bicycle Day, I hope you have a very safe one. I hope you celebrate it well. And yeah, here's to healing and transformation for all of us. Much love.